So now to introduce my friend Alan. Bishop Alan Shin was born in South Korea. His family moved to Washington, D.C. in 1972, where he attended Gonzaga College Prep High School, a Jesuit school for boys. He earned his bachelor's degree from Eastern Michigan in 1983, majoring in music and vocal performance. He then spent 4 years in New York City working as a professional singer before taking up a position as the choir director at a Korean Episcopal church in Chicago. Having gone through the discernment process in Chicago, Alan studied for his Master of Divinity degree at the General Theological Seminary in New York City, graduating in 1996. He was ordained to the priesthood in the Diocese of New York that December. Also in 1996, he was called as the curate assistant to the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in New York City, where he remained until 2001. At the same time, taking up the position of Assistant Officer, Episcopal Asia America Ministry at the Episcopal Church Center, a position that he held until 1999. In 2001, he earned the degree of Master of Sacred Theology from the General Theological Seminary. He then went to England, where from 2002 to 2005, he pursued postgraduate studies in patristic studies at the University of Oxford. Alan returned from England to the United States in 2010 to take up the position of rector at St. John's Church, Huntington, New York, in the Diocese of Long Island. He was elected Bishop Suffragan for the Diocese of New York on December 7th, 2013, and was consecrated at the cathedral on May 17th, 2014. It's my joy to work with Alan in the House of Bishops. His voice and his many gifts are a blessing to the church. Alan, welcome to Western Massachusetts.
Good morning. What a wonderful sunny but icy cold Saturday morning it is. And we've discovered Zoom during COVID, that wonderful tool which enabling us to hold this conference. I don't know why there's a Zoom thing there, but rather than canceling it. So I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to be with you today. And what an honor and a privilege it is for me to deliver the keynote address for this conference on a topic that could not be more urgent and important in our common life today. It is also humbling to be numbered among the past illustrious speakers, such as Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs, Reverend Dr. Mark Bozzuti Jones, and others. And I'm deeply grateful to my wonderful colleague and friend and your bishop, the Right Reverend Doug Fisher, for this invitation, and to your Social Justice Commission for inviting me today. I also want to acknowledge and express my personal thanks to Vicki Ix, for her welcome and for all the work and the preparation that she has done for this event. I know how much work goes into this. Thank you. And it is good to be with you. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. There we go. In 1992, the book that made quite a stir was The End of History, in which the author Francis Fukuyama celebrated the defeat of fascism and communism, which in turn ushered in a new world order under liberal democracy. The formation of the European Union in the following year further affirmed his thesis. Then the election of Barack Obama as the president of the US in 2008 was the culminating sign of the triumph of liberal democracy. It was the dawn of a new moral universe, with its arc imminently bending toward justice. Obama became the symbol of hope and the American dream, and America, the shining light of democracy and justice for the rest of the world. Well, this kumbaya, as we now know, was rather prematurely sung. We no longer hear much about Fukuyama's book. The arc of a moral universe feels like it has been cut short and now is bending toward nothing but chaos and uncertainty. So it makes me wonder whether the universe is fundamentally amoral, and whether such thing as the arc of a moral universe exists at all. Still, we struggle for justice because we must. And we dream of a moral universe because the alternative is horrifying. A moral universe is not given, but won by the struggles for justice. And its arc does not automatically bend toward justice, but it is bent toward justice by the intentional and often defiant acts of love, justice, and mercy. If we are imagining this arc in time, then one important battleground for justice is history. We have seen this play out in recent years. What to do with the Confederate monuments? How to teach race and how to teach history of slavery in schools? Whether the LGBTQ literature should be included in public libraries, and the rising tide of Christian nationalism, and so on. At the heart of all these issues is the battle over the shared understanding of what America is and what the American identity should be. And it all hinges on how the history of this nation is constructed and told. Recently, the presidential candidate Nikki Haley was asked about the cause of the Civil War, and her answer was the role of the government, without mentioning the slavery in the context. And just several days ago, she even said that America has never been a racist country. Downplaying or even outright excluding the slavery and racism from the historical narrative of this nation is not only disingenuous, but dangerous. Whitewashing or rationalizing the slavery with a ludicrous interpretation of history is still going on. Our preacher Valerie talked about this. And one such interpretation is that being enslaved gave the Black people the opportunity to learn new skills to live a better life. The whitewashing of the slavery was done also in the Episcopal Church. In 1861, the southern dioceses of the Episcopal Church seceded and created the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America, with Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia as its presiding bishop. So southern bishops insisted that it was a political separation, not a schism or a division on a moral or theological ground. Separated but not divided was the euphemism of the day. At the 1865 General Convention, the reunion was achieved without any mention of the slavery and without requiring the southern states to Southern bishops to address the issue at all. So long as they gave allegiance to the government of the United States, the ecclesiastical unity was simply a matter of fraternal vote. Both houses were all male back then. The issues of slavery and the status of the Black Episcopalians were kept out of the discussion altogether, leaving those issues to the local dioceses to legislate. In preserving its unity, the Episcopal Church system managed to preserve the culture of racism and white supremacy in its DNA, which it had inherited from the antebellum America. It was also not of insignificance that the presiding bishop at the time was Bishop John Henry Hopkins of Vermont, who held a pro-slavery view and had written a treatise on the biblical justification of slavery. In the following decade, the Episcopal Church saw an exodus of Black Episcopalians. In his book, Episcopalians and Race, Civil War to Civil Rights, the author Gardiner Shattuck says, despite their desire to remain loyal to the worship and beliefs of their church, African-American leaders realized that without the respect of the whites, unity alone was valueless. Unity was preserved by perpetuating the racial injustice in the Episcopal Church's system and DNA. History is a meaning-making and an identity-forming enterprise, and is all too often constructed to justify the superiority of those in power and to perpetuate the privileged status of the powerful, which is in turn presented as the universal history. Who writes history? Whose stories are included and excluded? And how the stories are weaved to construct a shared history, all have immense implications on the shared meaning and identity of a people. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a writer, a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, and a winner of PEN Pinter Prize. In 2009, she gave a TED Talk titled The Danger of a Single Story, which has garnered over 35 million views. She says, the single story produces stereotypes, and the problem with the stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. The consequence of a single story is this: it robs people of dignity. Nikki Haley's political rhetoric and the 1865 General Convention robbed the African Americans of their dignity. Adichie's vision of weaving many stories to tell a history is also how the salvation history is written in the Bible. The story of God's redemptive grace in the Hebrew scripture is told through the stories of a small tribe from Ur of the Chaldeans, who grew to be a nation of God's chosen people. In his recent book, Why the Bible Began, the author Jacob Wright proposes a thesis that the Hebrew Bible represents the first attempt in world history to construct what may properly be called a national identity. He brilliantly demonstrates how ancient Israel and Judah constructed a history of a resilient nationhood by weaving their stories of defeat, devastation, and slavery in diaspora into a salvation history of God's grace. The gospel story also weaves the stories of the poor and the marginalized of the society into the good news of Jesus Christ, the story of his healing grace and redemptive love. His birth stories already foreshadow a life in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed of the society, the babies born with no proper bed or home, the lowly shepherds living in the fields, the refugees who must escape the oppression of their ruler, and the innocent children sacrificed to preserve the power of the insane king. In the synagogue in Nazareth, Jesus declared his life's mission of struggle for justice in solidarity with the marginalized and the oppressed. The ultimate vision of his mission was nothing less than a moral universe, a beloved community of God's children. History is only redemptive and restorative when it weaves into it the stories of the forsaken and the marginalized of the society, because, as the British historian Lord Acton once said, truth is the only merit that gives dignity and worth to history. So here I end my first session. Vicky will share some of this. You will go into breakout groups and have some conversation. I sent Vicky some of these possible questions you might entertain in your conversation. And Vicky will tell us how long and all that stuff, and she's already figured that out, I think. Vicky, it's you. You're in charge now. I hope you had a wonderful, fruitful conversation there, and we'll move into the next session. I'm going to share the screen here. Do some truth telling here. In his book, After Virtue, the philosopher theologian Alasdair MacIntyre writes, man is essentially a storytelling animal, but a teller of stories that aspire to truth. Well, in this post-everything age, even facts and truth are relative and are manipulated to suit one's political persuasions and purposes. Yet, truth built on lies is really no truth at all, is it? It is a house built on sand. Built on lies, manipulations, and omissions of truth, history becomes a weapon of oppression and domination. And truth-telling becomes a dangerous exercise, especially in the climate of political divisions and conflicts, such as ours today. Yet, truth must be told and embraced, because only truth can liberate all of us and restore the dignity of every human being. So in this section, I would like to share the often neglected Asian history in the US and in the Episcopal Church. The stories of the Asian presence in America begins with the European colonization of Asia. From India to the Philippines and Indonesia, down to Australia, including many Pacific islands, there was not one geographic area that was not under the European colonization. And some of those territories later became the US colonies also. The Asian laborers were brought to Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Brazil by the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers as early as the 16th century. Soon after the abolition of slavery, which jeopardized the plantation economy, the indentured Asian laborers were brought to the Caribbean islands and South America. Between 1838 and 1917, 419 South Asian laborers were brought to Caribbean islands. Between 1847 and 1874, 140,000 Chinese laborers were brought to Cuba from the Portuguese colonial port of Macau. Between 1849 and 1874, 90,000 Chinese laborers were taken to Peru, and thousands of Asian laborers were brought to Brazil, Puerto Rico, Mexico in the 19th century. The African slavery economy was replaced by the indentured Asian labor economy, which is really another form of slavery, since the laborers could never pay their way out of the indentured servitude. In the US, the first Asian settlement was established sometime in the early to mid 1700s. A band of Filipino fishermen escaped a Spanish galleon to the marshland of Louisiana and built a community which came to be called Malong Village, or St. Malo. The village has been preserved by the Filipino Historical Society of Louisiana. And then we have the gold rush, which brought many Chinese laborers to California in the 19th century. And in 1849, 125 Chinese laborers arrived in California, and by 1852, over 20,000 Chinese laborers were brought over. And thousands of Japanese, Korean, Filipino laborers were also brought to Hawaii to work on the plantations, which were owned by white Christian missionaries. The increasing presence of Asians eventually fueled the anti-Asian xenophobia. This sentiment is reflected in the series of anti-Asian immigration laws enacted during the 19th and the 20th centuries. It began with the Page Act of 1875. In the atmosphere of the Yellow Peril, which was the pejorative term for the growing number of Chinese immigrants, the Republican representative of California, Horace Page, proposed a bill which in his own words was to end the cheap Chinese labor and the immigration of the immoral Chinese women. This act prohibited the immigration of the Chinese women to the US, and it was the precursor to the Chinese Exclusionary Act of 1882, which barred the Chinese immigration for 10 years and prohibited the Chinese from gaining citizenship and from land ownership. Another Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1888 allowed the deportation of the Chinese alien laborers. The Chinese Exclusionary Act was renewed with no end date in 1902. Then came the most sweeping law, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, which prohibited all Asian immigrations. This act was not repealed until 1952. No other minority group was the target of such extensive exclusive immigration policies. During this period, the Chinese immigrants were under constant threat of racial violence. 18 Chinese were lynched in the Los Angeles Chinatown massacre in 1871. The Chinatowns in Antioch and Santa Ana in California were burned down by a mob. The entrepreneurial Chinese fishermen established the first fishing industry in Monterey Bay, which was burned down and completely destroyed by a mob of white fishermen. That was in 1906. In the outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1900, the first person to die from the plague happened to be a Chinese in the Chinatowns in San Francisco. And this quickly inflamed the anti-Chinese racism. The Chinatowns in San Francisco and Honolulu were quarantined, and no one was allowed to leave except white residents because it was believed that white people could not catch the plague. And when a white woman in a wealthy white neighborhood in Honolulu became ill with the plague, there was an outcry to burn down the Chinatown. The editor of San Francisco Call wrote, "So long as it stands, so long will there be a menace of the appearance in San Francisco of every form of disease, plague, and pestilence, which Asiatic filth and vice generate. The only way to get rid of that menace is to eradicate Chinatown from the city." 25 blocks of the Chinatown in Honolulu was burned down, leaving 6,000 people homeless overnight. When the scientists discovered that the bubonic plague was caused by rats and insects and not by people, the politicians called it a new scientific hoax and refused to believe it. The most tragic government policy against Asian Americans, though, was the Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in 1942, which ordered the internment of 120,000 Japanese aliens and Japanese Americans. The managing secretary of the Grower Shipper Vegetable Association, Austin Anson, was quoted saying, "We are charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We might as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives in the Pacific coast or the brown man. If all the Japs were removed tomorrow, we would never miss them in 2 weeks because the white farmers can take over and produce everything the Jap grows. And we don't want them back when the war ends either." The last internment camp was not closed until well after the end of World War II on March 20th, 1946. While many Japanese Americans never went back to their homes on the West Coast, many others did and rebuilt their lives and their churches. Despite the anti-Asian immigration policies and the xenophobia, the first Asian mission in the Episcopal Church was begun in the Diocese of Nevada in 1874. The lay missioner named Ah Fu began ministering to the Chinese laborers and founded the Good Shepherd Chinese Mission in Carson City, where you can see right here, right near the California border, actually, Lake Tahoe there. And also the House of Prayer in the neighboring town of Virginia City. Unfortunately, the House of Prayer in Virginia burned down in 1875 with no cause recorded. And after the Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1882, there's no further record of the Good Shepherd Mission in Carson City. However, the Asian mission continued to take root in the Episcopal Church. St. Peter's Chinese Episcopal Church in Honolulu was founded in 1886. Then the first Chinese congregation on the continent, the True Sunshine Episcopal Church, was formed in San Francisco in 1905. The first Chinese Episcopal priest was ordained in 1912 to serve the Chinese missions. The first Japanese Episcopal Church, Christ Church in San Francisco, was founded in 1895. And the first Japanese Episcopal priest was ordained in 1901 to serve this congregation. Then in 1907, St. Mary's Japanese Church in Los Angeles was founded. And then St. Peter's Japanese Mission in Seattle in 1908. The first Korean Episcopal Church was founded in Honolulu in 1908. I am happy to say that all these churches remain active to this day. However, as more anti-Asian policies were promulgated, no new Asian mission was sustained in the Episcopal Church for the time being. The history of the Asian mission in the Episcopal Church was marked by apathy and silence in the face of the anti-Asian immigration policies and xenophobia. In the aftermath of World War II, however, we began to see a slow change in the immigration policies, culminating in the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened the doors to new immigrants from Asia. It is no accident that this policy change followed the civil rights movement. Many new Asian congregations of diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds were established in the following decades. Today, there are more than 140 Asian Episcopal congregations, including the first Cambodian Hmong congregation, and the first Hmong priest in the Anglican Communion was ordained in the Diocese of Minnesota in the entire Anglican Communion, as well as the first female Hmong priest. The first Burmese Karen congregation was established at All Saints Episcopal Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. It was made into a movie called All Saints, starring John Corbett in 2017. The Asian experiences in the Episcopal Church contain stories of grief and hope, and of death and resurrection. These stories witness to the resilient spirit and the redemptive grace of God in Jesus Christ, who did not forsake them in the trenches of racist immigration policies and xenophobia. It is time that the stories of the Asian American experiences be included in the history of the Episcopal Church to be a redemptive and restorative history of truth. We will break into small group once again at this point, and I have some questions that I only gave Vicky to send to you. She'll invite you into small breakout groups for a time. Vicky? Welcome back. So in this session is a closing session. I'm going to share a bit of a personal story as well. The Asian American dilemma. When Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, there was for many people, a hopeful new sign of a post-racial America. And at the time, I was in Oxford, UK, working as chaplain and theology tutor at Keble College in the University of Oxford. The excitement was palpable, even in this sleepy academic atmosphere. The subject of American studies suddenly gained the attention of this esoteric ivory tower, which cared more about the quality of wine at the high table dinner than the political affairs of 3,000 miles away. And I remember attending a lecture given by a professor of American studies, and the topic was the implication of the Obama election on the race relations in the US. The professor rightly pointed out that this election did not mean the end of racism in the US, and also said that the race relations in the US was a white-black issue. Now, several of us who were Asian Americans in the audience disagreed with his second point. His binary perspective on race did not seem to take into account the multicultural society that America had become, and in turn did not allow a legitimate space for other minority people, such as Asians and Latino Americans. He insisted, however, that because racism in the US had deep roots in the slavery of Black people, the race relations in the United States was fundamentally a white-Black issue. This is a dilemma for an Asian American like me. As someone who is neither white nor Black, where do I belong in this binary perspective and the structure of racial relations? Where does my story and the stories of other Asian Americans fit in this binary racial narrative and history? As an immigrant Korean American who has also lived a life of some privilege, I find it tricky to have conversations about racism in a binary racial structure. The one space that has often been allotted to Asian Americans is the model minority, a term coined by a sociologist in the 1960s. Although it sounds like a compliment, it is really a patronizing label that sets up a racial hierarchy with the African Americans at the bottom of the rung. In reality, it works to preserve and reinforce the structure and the culture of racism. On a good day, the overeducated and overachieving model minority is an acceptable token in the white mainstream society and culture. And on a bad day, the model minority is a dangerous outsider who does not belong in America and an acceptable target of aggression and scapegoating. in the binary racial structure, the in-between space is really a no man's land. When the pandemic began in 2020, the racist epithets like China virus and Kung flu fueled the anti-Asian xenophobia and hate crimes. This was the repeat of the bubonic plague 120 years ago. And soon after the pandemic began, my wife and I took up daily walks in the park near home to keep us sane from being locked down at home and from the exhausting schedule of Zoom meetings. And one day we saw a young white man riding his bike from the opposite direction. And as he was passing by us, he swerved toward us and said loudly, "I'm a masked police, making sure you are wearing your masks and not spreading the China virus." A few days later, we saw him again. This time, as he rode by us, he breathed on my wife, saying, "Take this, China virus." A few weeks later, we saw him again. And he rode by us and he made a quick swerve toward me as if to run me over. Then we noticed he had stopped ahead of us, staring at us and waiting for us. We had to change our course to avoid him that day. It was clear that he was intentionally targeting us. A walk for sanity turned into a walk of anxiety and stress. I found myself anxious and even a bit afraid to go outside during the pandemic. I had never experienced this kind of hate in the 50 years of my life in this country. In March 2021, when 6 Asian women were killed in Georgia in the middle of rising anti-Asian hate crimes, I wrote a pastoral letter to the diocese with support of my 2 colleague bishops. I addressed the surge of anti-Asian hate crimes and also wrote about the larger context of systemic racism, which was the cause of the deep racial divisions in our society. While there were positive responses to the letter, I also received hate mails accusing me of being an anti-white racist. The hate mails were accompanied by newspaper clippings of Black on Asian crimes, as if to prove that I was an anti-white racist. When Asian Americans speak up against racism and white supremacy, they are downgraded from the model minority to anti-white racists. When I was ordained priest, I served as curate at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square. And one day, after the noon mass, as I was standing at the door greeting people, a woman came up to me and looked into me and said, "Are you Dalai Lama?" Now, one comes across all kinds of people in Times Square, and I have been called many things before, but none so honorific. Now, this is a humorous story, and I have told it before, but frankly, there's also an uneasy stereotypical assumption in this question. It is along the same line with another question I've been asked occasionally. Why are you a Christian and not a Buddhist? Now, coming from a family of 4 generations of Christians, I quite never know how to answer that. This question comes with a lot of prejudicial baggage and stereotyping me into a religious box I have nothing to do with. Asked many times over, questions like this become suffocating. as I am put in a stereotypical box. Not only do I not belong in America, but also not in the Christian religion. The Asian presence in this nation and the Episcopal Church has a long history, as I earlier demonstrated. Many Asians have been Americans and Episcopalians for generations, and are not just recent immigrants or recent converts to the Christian faith. The binary understanding of racism and racial relations is a dilemma for Asian Americans. What are Asian Americans to do in this in-between no man's land, oscillating between the model minority and the perpetual outsider? I'll share the screen once again here. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Alistair McIntyre, in his book Again After Virtue, says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? The challenge for Asian Americans is that they can hardly find their stories included in the history of this country or of this church. The absence of their stories only reinforced the perpetual outsider syndrome and consciousness for Asian Americans. Can we imagine a new way of constructing a history that includes the stories of those who have been silenced and voiceless, so they can find a legitimate place of dignity in the history? I would like to suggest a theological way out of this dilemma. In Romans 11, Paul uses the image of a tree branch being grafted onto an olive tree as a metaphor of salvation. The olive tree represents the long history of God's covenant, and the grafted branches of the Gentiles who are saved by the grace of God's covenant just the same. Grafting allows a legitimate space for the Gentiles in God's salvation history. And God's salvation history in turn becomes the Gentile narrative of salvation. Neither does it diminish or change God's redemptive covenant, nor delegitimize the Gentiles' life and faith. In fact, grafting makes the grace of God's salvation available to everyone. It allows a legitimate space for everyone's story within God's salvation history. The pandemic exposed the deep pain and brokenness from 400 years of the systemic racism against African Americans. The post-racial America is a shimmering vision far on the horizon at best. And I have come to a conclusion that America cannot move forward until it is healed of the deep pain of the systemic racism against African Americans. The Oxford professor was partially right in this regard. However, the grafting metaphor also allows a legitimate space for my story in this painful American story, without changing the historical reality of this systemic racism or diminishing the need for healing and reparations of that sin. I have lived in this country for 52 years, And my Asian American story is now deeply grafted in the American story. And the American story, with all its painful and sinful past, with which I had nothing to do with, is also my story. I belong to this tree, and this tree is also my story. So what am I to do? I must tell my story and learn others' stories, because that is the only way to restore the dignity of those whose stories have been excluded and whose voices have been silenced. Lord Acton famously said, "History is not a burden on the memory, but an illumination of the soul." This is a profound insight into how history functions in and impacts the human, spiritual, and moral hemisphere. History at its best is about discovering the truth that illumines the human soul, bringing to light the transcendent capacity of the human spirit and shining the light upon the dark side of the human nature. I hope that my presentation this morning was not so much a burden on your memory as an illumination of your soul. Truth is often painful, but always illumines and liberates the soul. Thank you. I guess, Vicky, it's up to you. It's 11:17 already. You can go to small groups. I'm also open to do some Q&A.
Yeah, well, again, Alan, thank you so much. It was really a great conversation, and I'll see you next month at Hyde's celebration.
Yes,
St.
we
John the
will.
Divine. See you there.
Looking forward to
Yeah,
it.
I also again want to thank Valerie for her
Yes.
wonderful sermon. Thank Vicky
Yes.
for all the work she's put into this, and
Yes, absolutely.
and I want to thank our social justice committee. We have a really robust social justice committee that works in a number of different areas, and so I just want to thank them all for all the work they do year round. So thank you so much for that.